They say the strangest legends are born not from invention but from whispers no one dares to write down. Tonight, we open one of those whispers, one that once shook small rural communities, confounded priests and scientists, and left behind a tale so disturbing that generations afterward refused to repeat it aloud. It was the story of 24 little girls who entered an orphanage and, inexplicably, never seemed to grow older. Their hair remained the same shade, their faces unchanged, their limbs thin and childish even as decades slipped by. If you love dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing, because stories like this are not easy to come by. They are the kind you must search in crumbling newspapers, in diaries left in the dust of forgotten attics. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what time of night or morning it is right now. Perhaps you are already feeling the same unease that past witnesses described when they first stumbled on this tale. The first rumors emerged in the mid-19th century, when a group of farm workers in the American countryside noticed strange children staring from the windows of a stone building tucked away in the hills. To the locals, it looked like a convent or a boarding school, but few ever saw anyone come or go. What unsettled them was not the building itself, but the girls whose faces seemed eerily familiar year after year. When the workers passed by the following season, the same girls were still at the windows, wearing the same blank expressions, the same pinafores, their dark eyes unblinking. At first, villagers dismissed it as a trick of memory. Perhaps they had confused one child with another. But as seasons turned into years, and the community noticed no signs of growing adolescence, a quiet terror began to grow. What kind of place kept its children forever young? And why did the woman who ran the orphanage never allow outsiders through its doors, according to one old newspaper clipping? The orphanage was said to be under the care of a severe nun whose name appeared only once in records Mother Eveline. Little was written of her past, though rumors tied her to European convents that had closed under scandal. She had purchased the land quietly, with money no one could trace, and built the institution herself, brick by brick, with hired hands who claimed afterward that she made them work only at night. When they tried to speak about the job, their words faltered, as though some pressure weighed on their chests, warning them to remain silent. By the 1870s, the legend had already grown. A traveling preacher wrote in his journal of the unholy children with eyes of glass, whom he glimpsed while lodging in a nearby farmhouse. He claimed they stood perfectly still, lined in rows behind the windows, though no candle lit the rooms behind them. Not one smiled, not one blinked, he wrote. And though they looked no older than 7 or 8, I was told they had been there since the war. What terrified witnesses most was not only the unnatural stillness but the passage of time itself. Families who had lived in the area for decades swore that the same girls they saw as children in the 1850s still looked unchanged in the 1880s. They do not age, one farmer whispered to his son. They do not grow. They wait. No one knew what they were waiting for. There were other strange details, whispered in taverns or scribbled in diaries. The sisters, if they could be called that, were always seen in even numbers, never alone. If you counted 24 at one window, you would never see 23 the next time. Their presence was absolute, as if bound by an invisible order. And on stormy nights, people swore that soft singing could be heard drifting from the orphanage. Not hymns of comfort, but minor, chilling harmonies that raised gooseflesh on the arms of anyone who dared linger outside. Science had no place here, at least not yet. At this stage, it was only rumor and dread, an urban legend before the term existed. Still, the whispers spread until even physicians in neighboring towns became curious. Could it be malnutrition, a defect of growth? Yet none dared to press too hard, for Mother Eveline was known for her cold stare, and for the way she clutched her rosary so tight that her knuckles blanched white. Those who asked questions were told to mind their own business, to leave the children in peace. But peace was far from the word people used. To some, the girls were angels. To others, demons in disguise. One diary entry from a local midwife posed the question plainly. If they do not grow, then are they alive, or are they dolls that someone commands? And that question lingers even now. Were these girls victims of some forgotten illness, captives of a ritual none dared name, or something far darker than either possibility? The answers would not come quickly, for this story unfolds like the peeling of old wallpaper layer by layer, each more disturbing than the last. What would you have done had you been a villager there, watching from the fields as the same faces stared at you for 20 years? Would you have knocked on the orphanage door, or would you, like most, have crossed yourself and hurried home before night fell? One thing is certain, the whispers had begun. And whispers, once they take root, have a way of growing louder. The orphanage stood like a fortress of silence. Locals described it as a squat, gray building of stone and timber, constructed on a ridge where fog often clung to the earth like a living thing. Its windows were narrow, its roof pitched steeply as though designed to resist not just rain and snow, but prying eyes. Travelers rarely found it by accident. The dirt road that led there twisted through forest and field, until it seemed to vanish into nothingness. Only those who knew its path or were drawn by some darker pull ever reached its gates. Mother Eveline, the woman who ran it, was as much a mystery as the girls within. Records of her origins remain blurred, contradictory, or erased. Some claimed she had come from France, others from Bavaria. She spoke with an accent no one could place, sharp and deliberate, as if every word was chosen with unnatural care. Her presence unsettled people tall and thin, always in heavy black garments no matter the heat of summer, and eyes so pale they looked nearly colorless. To the surrounding villages, Eveline offered no warmth, no invitations to visit, no sermons or open masses. Her orphanage did not ask for donations, did not plead for assistance. It stood entirely apart, self-sufficient, sealed away. This secrecy alone might not have been remarkable. Many convents in Europe lived in similar isolation, but in the young United States, where community was lifeblood, such detachment was unnatural. Suspicion grew with every passing season, but suspicion was met with fear. Farmers who lived nearest the orphanage claimed Eveline walked to the fields at night, carrying a lantern that gave off little light. She never spoke to them, never acknowledged their presence. On more than one occasion, she was seen alone by the fence line, lips moving silently as if in prayer or incantation. Her rosary beads glinted in the moonlight. But those who watched swore the rhythm of her words did not sound like any prayer they had ever known. And then there were the bells. Each dawn and dusk, the orphanage bells tolled not the sweet, bright ringing of a church calling its flock, but deep, sonorous chimes that rolled across the hills like distant thunder. Some villagers timed their meals and work to the sound, even as they shuddered at it. Children covered their ears. Livestock, strangely, sometimes grew restless when the bells rang, stamping hooves or pulling at their ropes. Inside those stone walls, what life did the sisters live outsiders never entered to see? The stories that filtered through came only from fleeting glimpses. One peddler delivering goods claimed he saw rows of small wooden desks in a dim hall, each with a girl sitting perfectly upright, hands folded, eyes forward. He thought them well behaved until he noticed none of them moved, not even to blink, until Mother Eveline struck a small brass bell. Then, in unison, they lowered their heads as though commanded by a single will. The peddler never returned, and his account was repeated only once, in a drunken haze, before he begged that it be forgotten. The building itself carried an aura of dread. Some said it was never entirely dark inside. Even at night, a dull glow leaked from its upper windows. Others whispered the opposite, that no matter how bright the sun outside, the orphanage remained shadowed, its corridors unlit, as though light itself refused to enter. Still, what disturbed people most was not the structure, but the certainty that the children within did not change. A decade might pass, yet those who glimpsed the windows swore the same 24 faces peered out unaltered, neither growing older nor younger, neither joyful nor sorrowful. The passage of time seemed suspended behind those walls. Was Eveline protecting them, or was she binding them in some unnatural stasis? When a traveling bishop inquired about the orphanage during a visitation to the region, the local parish priest could offer little. "It is a house of God," the priest murmured, though he avoided eye contact, but his hesitation betrayed him. If the orphanage was truly a place of sanctity, why were its children never presented at church? Why were they never baptized in the open, confirmed, or even allowed to play among the village children? No communion records exist for them, no burial plots either. It was as if the sisters had no place in the life or death of the community. And still, life went on around them. Farmers planted crops, merchants sold goods. Families raised their children. Yet the orphanage loomed above it all, a reminder of something unnatural that no one dared confront. To speak of it was to invite unease into your own home. Better to ignore, better to pretend the bells were simply bells and not signals of something darker. But ignoring the orphanage did not erase it. Storms came, wars passed, generations changed, and still the orphanage remained, unchanged as its children. To some, it became almost a fixture, like a haunted hill or a cursed oak. To others, it was a festering wound in the land, a place no one should approach after sundown. Even now, scholars who dig into county records find gaps surrounding that property, missing deeds, incomplete census counts, erased maps. The isolation was not just geographical, it was as though history itself had conspired to conceal the place. But legends, no matter how carefully suppressed, leave traces. And in those traces, the orphanage breathes again. If you walked there today, would you feel the same chill the villagers described? Would you see faces in the windows, pale and unchanging, watching from behind cracked glass, and more importantly, would they still number exactly 24? The stories of how the 24 girls arrived at the orphanage were never told in one place. Instead, they drifted through scattered memories, yellowing newspaper fragments, and letters scribbled in the margins of family Bibles. When pieced together, a disturbing pattern emerges. None of the girls seem to come from anywhere recognizable. They appeared as if summoned, delivered to Mother Eveline, under circumstances that defied explanation. Some were found abandoned in the woods, wrapped in blankets that bore no sign of dirt or travel. One farmer swore he discovered 2 infants placed in a wooden crate at the edge of his field, both swaddled in identical white cloth. He told neighbors he brought them to the orphanage in the dead of night, relieved to hand them over. Yet, when pressed later, he could not recall how old they were, whether newborns or toddlers. He said only that their faces were strangely complete, as though sculpted rather than born. Others were left at crossroads or on church steps, but never claimed by grieving families. In some cases, the notes pinned to their clothes contained no names, only symbols, crosses drawn upside down, circles broken in half, or strings of letters that matched no known language. Local ministers declared these marks the work of superstition, but the symbols reappeared again and again. Curiously, whenever such a child was delivered to Eveline's orphanage, she seemed to know in advance, waiting by the door as if she had been warned of their arrival. What unnerved the community most was that no matter the year, no matter the supposed age of the newcomers, they always seemed to settle at the same point of growth, small. Frail bodies no older than 8, with eyes wide and vacant, hair untouched by gray or change. Even children, supposedly taken in as babies, appeared to catch up unnaturally fast, freezing in that uncanny stage of perpetual youth. Eveline referred to them only as my sisters, though none were related by blood. To outsiders, they appeared identical in spirit, 24 copies of stillness and silence. There were whispers that some children had been taken against their parents' will. One mother in a nearby village claimed that a cloaked woman came to her cabin one night, offering food and coin in exchange for her sickly daughter. When she refused, she awoke the next morning to find the child gone, the door unbarred, and no trace of entry. Desperate, she confronted Eveline at the orphanage gates, but the nun denied all knowledge. And yet, through a narrow crack in the shutters, the mother swore she glimpsed her child's face unchanged, unsmiling, pressed against the glass like a doll. How many of these stories were true, it is impossible to know. Yet, by the 1880s, the number 24 had become fixed. No more girls appeared, none disappeared. The order was absolute. If one stood at the window, all 24 stood beside her. They never left the grounds, never mingled with outsiders, never grew tall enough to match their supposed ages. They were bound, not only to the orphanage, but seemingly to one another. Travelers who stayed in nearby inns often reported the same chilling encounter late at night. When the fog rolled thick over the hills, they saw a procession of small figures moving in unison through the courtyard. 24 girls, barefoot, white gowns glowing faintly in the moonlight, walking in a perfect circle. The witness would blink, and the circle dissolved into nothing, leaving only the silent building behind. It was around this time that rumors spread of the sisters' strange behaviors inside. According to a carpenter hired briefly for repairs, the girls rarely spoke. When they did, their voices overlapped, as though reciting the same words in eerie unison. He claimed they answered questions before he finished asking them. Their replies flat, identical, and without emotion. Once, when he dropped his hammer, all 24 turned their heads towards the sound simultaneously, eyes fixed, unblinking. He left the job unfinished, refusing to return. The town physician, persuaded to examine one of the girls after a supposed fainting spell, reported something even more disturbing. Her pulse was steady, but so faint he could scarcely measure it. Her skin, cold to the touch, showed no sign of illness. When he asked Eveline how long the girl had been under her care, she smiled without warmth and answered, "Longer than you have drawn breath." The physician never spoke publicly of the incident again. By now, the girls had become legend among children in the village. Dares were made to approach the orphanage gates after dusk, to count the faces at the window, to whisper names and see if the girls would turn their heads. Some boys claimed they saw the sisters mimic their own gestures from behind the glass, raising hands in perfect imitation. Others swore they heard voices echo their laughter in the night air, even when no laughter came from their own throats. Parents warned their children never to linger near the grounds, but warnings only deepened curiosity. The sisters became a tale to frighten misbehaving children. Do as you're told, or the sisters will take you. Yet even adults could not banish their unease. What was Eveline's purpose in gathering them? Why 24, no more, no less, and why did time itself seem to halt at her command? The community began to ask questions it could not answer. Were the sisters abandoned innocents, cursed by fate, or were they participants in something far older, bound by a pact no outsider could comprehend? The girls' frozen faces gave no answers, only more silence. And so, the orphanage remained sealed in mystery, its 24 sisters peering outward at a world that aged and decayed while they stood untouched. But the whispers were growing louder. Priests, doctors, and skeptics alike would soon be drawn to investigate, and what they found would only deepen the dread. It was one thing for villagers to whisper among themselves about the orphanage, but another for outsiders, people with no reason to invent stories to confirm what they had long suspected. Witnesses, unconnected by blood or creed, began leaving behind testimonies of what they saw. Some appeared in forgotten county ledgers, some in faded travel journals, and others in letters sent to distant relatives who never believed them. Taken together, their voices form a chorus of dread that refuses to die. One account came from a schoolteacher named Lydia Whitman, who traveled through the region in the early 1890s. She wrote to her sister in Boston about the strange children she glimpsed from the roadside. There were 24 of them, she explained, all lined at the windows as though awaiting my arrival. Their faces were pale, expressionless, yet their eyes followed me until I passed beyond the bend. I cannot forget those eyes, for though they were young, they carried no youth, only the vacancy of dolls. Lydia insisted she had returned 2 years later by chance, only to see the same girls, unchanged, wearing identical dresses. Her letter ended with a question scrawled in a trembling hand. How can they still be children? Farmers told similar tales. A man named Isaac Dole remembered plowing his fields under a heavy dusk when he felt the prickle of being watched. Looking up, he saw the 24 sisters standing outside the orphanage fence. Their gowns fluttering, though the air was still. He turned to fetch his lantern, but when he looked back seconds later, they were gone, and the field lay silent. Dole claimed that afterward his cattle refused to graze near that fence line, no matter how he drove them. Perhaps the most unsettling testimony came from a young peddler named Thomas Heller, who sold trinkets door to door. He claimed Evelyn reluctantly allowed him into the orphanage hall for a single transaction, candles and needles, and though he never entered farther than the threshold, what he saw haunted him forever. The girls sat in wooden chairs against the wall, hands folded, heads tilted in identical angles. Not one child shifted in her seat, not one coughed or blinked. Heller swore they stared straight ahead, their pupils dilated as though in shadow, though the room was well lit. He noticed something else when Evelyn took the coins from him. The girl's lips moved in silence, as if murmuring words in a tongue he could not hear. Some testimonies appeared much later, when caretakers or laborers confessed on their deathbeds. A groundskeeper named Aaron Coates admitted he had once been hired to chop wood for the orphanage. He said the girls never approached him, but he often caught them staring from the corners of the yard, always in groups, never alone. When I counted them, he whispered to his grandson decades later, the number was always 24. Always. I once counted 23 and thought one was missing. But before I could look again, the missing girl was at my side, close enough to touch. I swear I never heard her move. Newspapers occasionally printed such stories, though usually in small columns buried deep within the pages. Editors dismissed them as rural superstition, cautionary tales for children. But not everyone was so quick to mock. In private letters, traveling ministers confessed that the matter troubled them deeply. One wrote, "If these children are indeed without growth, then they are souls without passage. God does not keep flesh from aging. Something else holds them still." It was not only religious men who were disturbed. A traveling photographer claimed he once tried to capture an image of the girls through the glass. He developed the plate in his wagon and was horrified to discover that while the orphanage walls appeared clear, the girls themselves were blurred, their faces smudged into indistinguishable shadows. He destroyed the plate and vowed never to pass through the valley again. What strikes us now is how consistent the reports were. Different eyes, different years, but the same details repeated the number 24. The absence of aging, the synchronized movements, the suffocating silence. These were not passing misperceptions, but experiences so vivid they drove hardened men to tremble and devout women to question their prayers. Yet, witnesses did not all agree on one thing: whether the girls wanted to be seen. Some insisted the sisters pressed their faces to the glass deliberately, eyes locked on outsiders as though hungry for attention. Others claimed the girls avoided all notice, appearing only at night or in fleeting glimpses, vanishing when observed too closely. Which was true could both be true, depending on the watcher and every testimony. However, Eveline loomed like a shadow. She never denied the existence of the girls, but she offered no explanations either. To those who questioned her, she replied with clipped phrases: "They are safe. They are under my care. They are not your concern." The witnesses left unsettled, muttering that her words sounded less like reassurances than warnings. And so the mystery thickened, passed from mouth to ear, testimony to testimony. The orphanage grew into a place of dread not because of what happened inside its walls, but because no one could ever prove or disprove what they saw. Science had not yet set its eye upon the sisters. Religion had not yet spoken its final word. For now, there were only witnesses, ordinary men and women who swore they had looked upon something that should not exist. If you had stood there yourself, peering through those narrow windows, what would you have seen? Would the sisters turn their heads in perfect unison to acknowledge you? Would you have dared to count them? Whispering 1, 2, 3, until you reached the haunting number 24. And what would you have done if, as some swore, the count came out wrong? The testimonies leave us with no answers, only more dread. And dread has a way of demanding explanation, pulling priests, doctors, and seekers of forbidden truth to the orphanage gates. They would not be turned away forever. The first man to faith to pierce the orphanage gates with any authority was Father Matthias, a parish priest from a nearby county who had heard whispers of the 24 sisters for years. His journals, later discovered in a locked drawer at his rectory, contain some of the most chilling descriptions of the children and their caretaker. They reveal a man both resolute in his belief and tormented by what he encountered. Matthias recorded that he first approached the orphanage under the pretense of offering the sacrament of confirmation. It disturbed him. He wrote that no record existed of the girls ever being baptized or receiving communion. In the Catholic Church, this was unthinkable. He rang the orphanage bell at dusk, and after several tense minutes, Mother Eveline opened the door only a crack. Her face was expressionless, her voice calm. "They are confirmed," she told him flatly. When he asked for proof, she replied, "Their confirmation lies not in paper but in permanence." This cryptic answer only deepened his resolve. Matthias returned a week later, armed with holy water and his crucifix, determined to perform rites whether Eveline approved or not. She allowed him in, perhaps out of arrogance or perhaps because she knew resistance was pointless. Inside, Matthias described a chapel of sorts, long wooden benches, an altar stripped of ornament, and the sisters lined in rows like statues. He noted that the air inside was oppressively still. When he lifted the crucifix, the children turned their heads simultaneously toward it, eyes wide but not fearful. He sprinkled holy water, murmuring the words of blessing. Yet the droplets seemed to hang in the air, never landing upon their skin. Disturbed, he pressed onward, reciting prayers of protection. That was when, he claimed, the whispering began. At first it was faint, a rustle like leaves in wind. Then, unmistakably, words, 24 voices speaking in unison, though their lips barely moved. He could not make out the language. It was neither Latin, Greek, nor any tongue he knew. The sound grew louder until the crucifix in his hand trembled. Eveline placed a firm hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Do not provoke them." In his journal, Matthias wrote that fear gripped him more tightly than at any exorcism he had ever attempted. He dropped his crucifix, and the voices ceased instantly. The sisters returned to silence, eyes forward, as though nothing had transpired. Eveline picked up the crucifix herself, placed it back in his hand, and said softly, "You cannot drive out what was never driven in." Matthias fled that night, yet he returned twice more, compelled by both faith and obsession. On his second visit, he brought candles and attempted to record the chants he heard. His notes describe a repeated phrase, "Veni sorores aeternam," which he translated clumsily as, "Come sisters eternal." The girls spoke it in rhythms like waves, rising and falling together. He tried to counter with the Lord's Prayer, but his voice faltered as theirs grew louder, until he collapsed in exhaustion. Eveline carried him to the door and told him to rest. "You waste your strength fighting permanence," she whispered again. By his third visit, Matthias was broken. His journal entries became erratic, filled with drawings of circles and strange letters. One page was stained with what looked like blood, marked only by the words, "They do not belong to God, nor to man." Soon after, Matthias vanished. Some say he fled to Europe in shame, others that he took his own life. His parish never heard from him again. But the journals remained, hidden, until discovered decades later by chance. Other priests were warned away by Eveline herself. Those who pressed her too far were met with sudden illness, strokes of misfortune that drove them back to their own parishes. Rumors grew that Eveline had power over them, that her rosary was no ordinary set of beads, but a chain of charms, each one representing a vow or a bargain. Witnesses swore that when she prayed, the sisters shifted slightly, as though her words bound their bodies in invisible ropes. The most disturbing detail came not from Matthias, but from a young novice priest who once accompanied him. In his own testimony, written years later, he confessed to sneaking into the orphanage alone one stormy night. He described the chapel again, but this time, the altar was lit with candles that burned blue instead of yellow. The sisters stood in a circle, hands joined, whispering. Eveline was at the center, eyes closed, her lips moving in the same rhythm. When the novice dropped his lantern in fear, the girls turned to face him, and every candle extinguished at once. He fled into the night, never to return. What was Eveline doing with them? Was she protecting them from a curse, or was she the curse itself? The church never gave an official answer. Matthias's journals were quietly suppressed, locked away by higher authorities who likely feared scandal more than they feared the truth. Yet whispers of his attempt spread nonetheless, fueling the legend. If these were ordinary children, why did holy water fail to touch them, if they were souls in need of saving? Why did prayers only stir them to chant in tongues unknown? And if they were not children at all, then what were they? The priest's forbidden records leave us no closer to resolution. Instead, they deepen the mystery, painting Eveline not as a guardian nun, but as a keeper of something neither holy nor human. Something that listened, responded, and endured. Would you, in Matthias's place, have raised the crucifix again, or would you have fled, leaving the 24 sisters to their eternity of silence? The choice, perhaps, was never his to make. For decades, the church whispered about the orphanage but never acted openly. Yet, science, restless, curious, and arrogant, eventually stepped across the threshold Eveline had kept so fiercely guarded. Physicians and natural philosophers from nearby towns had heard the rumors, and some could not resist the lure of a medical impossibility: 24 children who never aged. To them, it was not a matter of faith or blasphemy, but of discovery. What secret of the human body might be uncovered within those walls? The earliest medical report dates to the 1890s. Written by a doctor whose name was never printed in full, only the initials R. H. His notes, found decades later in a locked chest, describe being invited privately to observe one of the girls. Eveline herself arranged the visit, though the reasons remain unclear. Perhaps she wanted to demonstrate her power, or perhaps she thought she could control what the doctor recorded. R.H. wrote that the girl he examined looked no older than 7 years, with delicate features and skin so pale it seemed translucent. He measured her height, her weight, and her pulse. All readings fell within the range of a healthy child. Yet, when he checked her teeth, he discovered something unnerving, though they appeared as the teeth of a child. There was no sign of growth or loss. No deciduous roots, no eruption, he scrawled. Teeth appear complete and unchanging. Her eyes, too, disturbed him. The pupils dilated unevenly, reacting sluggishly to light. When he tried to test her reflexes, she only stared, her expression vacant. But when Eveline entered the room, the child's eyes immediately shifted, as though awakened by her presence. They respond not to the world, R.H. wrote, but to her alone. He returned twice more, each time under Eveline's supervision. On his second visit, he tried drawing a small sample of blood. The fluid that filled the vial was dark, thicker than he expected, and clotted almost instantly. When he attempted to test it later, the sample dissolved into a black residue, leaving no trace of recognizable human cells. If this is blood, he concluded, it does not belong to the living. R.H. disappeared shortly after his final visit. His colleagues assumed he had left the county for professional reasons, but his family received no letters, no word at all. The chest of notes was discovered only after his abandoned home was reclaimed by the town. The implication was clear: those who studied the sisters too closely were swallowed by the same silence that surrounded them. Other doctors came in secret, though fewer dared to leave written accounts. Some whispered that Eveline summoned them not for study, but for something more sinister. One rumor claimed she demanded blood transfusions, forcing physicians to supply their own veins to keep the sisters balanced. Another tale described a doctor who returned home pale and broken, muttering that he had seen 24 identical heartbeats flickering across a single stethoscope. He was found dead in his bed days later, his chest marked with bruises shaped like small, childlike hands. Still, not all physicians vanished. A German pathologist, Heinrich Kessler, spoke once at a private gathering in New York about the case of the Eternal Sisters. He described examining skeletal X-rays that were sent to him anonymously, images of small, childlike frames with joints fused strangely, as though bone growth had been halted mid-process. The images, he claimed, could not belong to living, moving children. Yet, he admitted he could not prove their origin, and when pressed for details, he fell silent. Weeks later, Kessler was dismissed from his post under unexplained scandal and returned to Europe, never to lecture again. Why did Eveline allow any doctors at all? Was it to mock their helplessness, to reinforce the mystery? Or was she searching for someone, some man of science who could help sustain what she had created if these children required maintenance? Perhaps she could not do it alone. Perhaps each physician was drawn in, tested, and discarded when he failed. The most disturbing rumor surfaced in the 1920s, long after Eveline herself should have been dead. A retired nurse named Clara recalled being approached as a young woman by a woman in black who carried a rosary of strange metal beads. This woman, never naming herself, offered Clara a fortune to join her as a caretaker for children who would never grow. Clara refused, laughing nervously at what she thought a madwoman's tale. But when shown a photograph blurry, dimly lit, yet unmistakable, she froze. The image revealed rows of small girls, all identical in stature, their eyes glowing faintly as though reflecting candlelight. Clara left the meeting shaken and never spoke of it until her final years. when she confessed the story to her family. If the sisters truly remained through decades, what became of them? Did Eveline recruit doctors to preserve them, patching the rift between nature and unnatural stasis, or did she merely lure men of science to witness the impossible? Ensuring their silence through means no one dared admit, one detail emerges again and again in fragments of testimony whenever doctors tried to measure, probe, or dissect the truth of the sisters. The results slipped away. Blood spoiled, photographs blurred, written records vanished. Science could not hold them, and those who tried too hard were erased as cleanly as chalk wiped from a slate. Today, no hospital archives list their names. No universities record their cases. The silence is too complete to be accidental. Either every doctor who entered those halls was silenced by Eveline herself, or something far larger conspired to bury the truth. If science failed, then what chance did faith or folklore have? And if the 24 sisters still walk somewhere in the shadows of history, unchanged, then one question looms over us all. Were they subjects of study? Or were the doctors the true experiment? Storms have always carried a weight of superstition, but around the orphanage they took on a meaning more sinister. Old diaries, fading clippings, and whispered accounts agree on this. When lightning split the sky and rain pounded the hills, the sisters changed. They moved, they spoke, and their silence became sound. One villager, Mary Colton, described in her memoirs the night she sheltered with her family during a summer storm in 1903. Their cottage stood less than a mile from the orphanage, and as the winds howled, they heard faint voices carried across the fields. At first, they thought it the wind itself, but the pattern was unmistakable words spoken in rhythm, rising and falling like a tide. Mary's father opened the shutters to peer outside. Lightning illuminated the ridge, and for a fraction of a second, he saw them, 24 girls, standing in the orphanage courtyard, gowns plastered by rain, chanting in perfect unison though the storm drowned out all else. The next morning, he denied what he had seen, but Mary never forgot. Other witnesses described nights of terror when thunder rattled the windows. A traveling merchant once claimed he passed by the orphanage in a downpour and saw lights flickering unnaturally blue flames that danced not on candles, but in midair. Within those ghostly lights, he swore he saw shadows moving without bodies, sliding along walls and ceilings, stretching in ways no human form could stretch. The merchant, hardened by years on the road, broke into tears as he told the tale at an inn, repeating only children should not move like that. Children should not sound like that. The sisters' chanting was not always contained within their walls. Farmers plowing by lantern light claimed they heard echoes rolling down from the ridge, phrases repeated 24 times over, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a language no one could identify. One man recited what he believed he heard ad lucem aeternam, toward eternal light, but others insisted the words were darker, promising allegiance not to heaven but to something older, nameless, waiting. One chilling account came from a mail carrier who took shelter under the orphanage eaves during a sudden storm. He reported that the rain stopped the moment he stepped onto the porch. Inside, he could hear the girls chanting, their voices building into a pitch so high it made his teeth ache. Then silence. When he dared look through the keyhole, he saw nothing but darkness yet in that darkness. 24 pairs of eyes gleamed faintly, staring directly back at him. He fled, abandoning his route, and never again accepted work in that county. Even those who tried to dismiss the stories admitted strange phenomena during storms. Horses refused to approach the ridge, their bodies trembling violently. Dogs howled in unison at the tolling of the orphanage bell. Lightning seemed to strike unnaturally, often near the building, as if drawn to it, illuminating the stone walls in flashes that revealed silhouettes of girls who vanished when the light faded. Perhaps the most disturbing testimonies involve full moons. On such nights, whether storm or clear sky, villagers claimed the sisters could be heard not chanting, but singing. The songs were low, melodic, almost beautiful, yet the beauty carried despair. A witness described the sound as a lullaby for the dead. Several claimed they saw the girls walking the perimeter of the orphanage grounds, barefoot, hands linked, circling slowly as if enacting some ritual. When interrupted by a snapped twig, a cough, a human presence, they stopped instantly, heads turning together toward the intruder. More than one trespasser swore they saw the girls smiling faintly in the moonlight, though their lips never parted. Stranger still, storms seemed to trigger phenomena within nearby homes. Lamps flickered, clocks stopped at midnight, and children complained of voices whispering to them from the corners of darkened rooms. One farmer's son screamed that the sisters are inside after waking to see 24 small shadows at the foot of his bed. The boy's hair turned white within the week, and though he lived into adulthood, he never spoke of that night again. Scientists and priests alike tried to rationalize these tales, but even they struggled to explain why storms amplified the sisters' presence. Was it the raw energy of lightning and thunder feeding something unnatural within them, or was it simply that storms gave witnesses an excuse for their fears? A backdrop for imagination. Yet the consistency of details, the number 24, the unison of voices, the strange lights defies mere folklore. Some modern researchers speculate that Eveline used the storms deliberately, timing her rituals to coincide with the violence of nature. Energy, after all, has always played a role in both occult and scientific experiments. Could the orphanage have been more than a home? Could it have been a laboratory of faith, twisted into something darker, where thunder itself was harnessed to keep the sisters bound in perpetual youth? We cannot know for certain. What we have are stories, fragments of terror scrawled by people who had no reason to invent them, people who lived and died with these memories gnawing at them. Stories of lightning that revealed too much, of shadows that belonged to no body, of voices that carried across rain-soaked fields long after midnight, and, if the sisters truly chanted during storms, the most haunting question remains to whom or to what were they speaking? Would you, if standing in that valley during a tempest, dare to look toward the orphanage ridge? Would you listen to the voices carried by the wind, risking that they might notice you listening? For those who did, their lives were never the same. Storms came and went, but the memory of the sisters' voices lingered forever, like an echo that refuses to fade. No mystery remains untouched forever. By the early 20th century, villagers began to whisper that the orphanage itself had begun to fade. Not crumble in the way of ordinary buildings, but fade as though stone and timber were slipping from the fabric of the world. One spring, travelers reported the doors chained and the windows shuttered. By autumn, a few claimed the structure was already empty. Within a handful of years, the place that had stood immovable for generations seemed to vanish, leaving behind only cracked foundations swallowed by weeds. But if the orphanage disappeared, the sisters did not. The first alleged sighting came from a shopkeeper in a nearby town, who claimed a pale child stood silently in his store one morning before opening. She wore a white dress soaked by dew, though the day was dry. When he turned to fetch her water, she was gone, shaken. He described her to his wife, who immediately whispered, "That's one of Eveline's girls." Later, when he dared speak of it to others, several neighbors admitted they had seen similar figures wandering the fields at dawn, always small, always silent, and always alone. Over the next decades, rumors multiplied. A farmer's wife swore she saw two girls standing hand in hand at the edge of her orchard in the moonlight. A railway conductor told of a child who boarded his train without ticket or escort, only to vanish between one stop and the next. An innkeeper recorded in his guest book that 24 girls once arrived together, each signing the same name in identical handwriting. He tore the page out, terrified of what he had allowed into his home. Though each story differed, one detail bound them all: none of the girls ever appeared to age, from the 1850s to the 1920s. The descriptions never wavered: frail bodies of 7 or 8 years, pale skin, hollow eyes, voices rarely raised above a whisper. If the orphanage had crumbled, time had not claimed its children. They had been released. Historians searching county records find something stranger still: the property on which the orphanage stood was quietly sold, then resold, but always under shell names and false deeds. No legal trace of demolition exists. Surveyors decades later remarked on foundations that seemed too new to be so overgrown, as though the building had been erased rather than abandoned. Eveline herself vanished into the silence. No death record, no grave, no obituary. It was as if she had been erased along with the building. Yet, in one parish ledger from 1911, a priest recorded hearing confession from a tall woman with pale eyes who smelled of storm air. She asked for forgiveness, not for her sins, but for what must remain unburied. He pressed her for her name, but she smiled and whispered Eveline. He wrote that she disappeared from the confessional before he could open the door. The sisters' appearances were not always harmless. In one mining town, children vanished from their beds after neighbors reported seeing pale figures drifting between the houses at night. The missing were never found. In a remote farmhouse, a family awoke to find 24 small handprints scorched into the soot of their hearthstone. They fled that very morning, abandoning the home forever. By the 1940s, the orphanage had become a local legend, its physical place lost, but its children still feared. Folklorists collecting tales in the region noticed how often farmers crossed themselves when the subject arose, or lowered their voices as if afraid the sisters might hear. The number 24 carried such weight that when a traveling circus brought 24 child performers into a nearby town, the audience fled halfway through, convinced Eveline's brood had returned. Stranger still are the modern reports. In the 1960s, a motorist claimed he picked up a young girl in a soaked white dress by the roadside. She asked for nothing, but stared out the window as he drove. When he glanced at her in the mirror, he saw not one child, but 24 faces staring back. The car swerved, and when he regained control, the passenger seat was empty. Police records confirm his crash, though no passenger was ever listed. Hikers in the 1980s claimed to stumble upon the ruins of an old stone foundation in the hills. They described carvings still visible on the stone circles, crosses reversed, and rows of symbols repeating 24 times. Some claimed they heard faint voices in the wind, counting slowly in a language they did not understand. And today, some residents insist the sisters still wander. Late-night drivers whisper of children crossing deserted roads, hands linked in a chain that vanishes when headlights strike. Urban explorers tell of abandoned houses where 24 pairs of shoes, too small and too new, sit lined against the wall. Photographers capture blurred shapes, always in groups of 24, smudged like smoke across their lenses. The orphanage itself may be gone, but its children are not bound to brick and timber. Whatever Eveline began, whatever bargain she sealed, the sisters seem bound not to a place, but to a permanence that science and faith alike failed to shatter. And if you travel through those valleys, you may ask yourself, would you know them if you saw them? Would you count 1, 2, 3, until you reach the number 24, and realize too late that you had become part of the legend? For some say the sisters do not simply wander. They seek, and when they appear, it is not only to be seen, but to choose. When the orphanage had finally faded into ruin, or been swallowed by something larger than ruin, the human mind rushed to fill the void with theories. People needed explanations, even terrible ones, for why 24 girls had never grown, why storms seemed to answer their voices, and why witnesses vanished after speaking too boldly. Theories became whispers, and whispers became forbidden lore. The first and simplest idea was that Eveline had been a practitioner of occult arts. Folklorists noted how her rituals coincided with storms, how her rosary resembled a chain of charms, and how the sisters seemed bound to her presence. Some whispered that Eveline had made a bargain eternal guardianship in exchange for keeping the girls frozen between life and death. To whom did she bargain? The devil, some said. But others argued it was something older, an entity of permanence, a spirit that fed not on worship but on stillness, on the refusal of time itself. Yet skeptics offered darker, earthly theories. They suggested Eveline might have been experimenting with early medical practices, using forbidden methods on orphans abandoned to her care. In this view, the girls were not supernatural, but victims kept in a suspended state by toxins, starvation, or experimental serums. Physicians who vanished after visiting the orphanage might have uncovered truths so grotesque they chose silence, or Eveline herself ensured their silence. But if this were true, how could the same girls be sighted decades apart, unchanged? In towns miles away from the orphanage, could a cruel science explain that? Then there was the theory of imitation that the sisters were not human at all. Some witnesses described them as too still, their movements too synchronized, their voices too hollow. Perhaps they were constructs dolls animated by ritual, or shells inhabited by a single collective spirit. In this theory, there were never 24 individuals, but one presence manifesting 24 times. Their youth was not preserved, it was fabricated, an illusion maintained for as long as Eveline's rituals held power. The most terrifying theory, however, does not place Eveline as master, but as servant. It imagines that she did not create or summon the sisters, but stumbled upon them. That the 24 had always been here, predating towns, predating the church itself. Eveline, in this view, was only their caretaker, the one who accepted the burden of keeping them contained within stone walls. When the orphanage vanished, the burden was released. The world now bore the sisters' presence without any barrier, and sightings across states and decades were simply evidence that the containment had failed. Religious thinkers were divided. Some argued the sisters were angels, frozen in time as a test of human faith. Others saw them as demonic host vessels, their unaging bodies evidence of souls withheld from God. A fringe sect even declared them reincarnations stuck in endless repetition, cursed to relive childhood until the cycle was broken. None of these interpretations satisfied the dread, for each left the same unanswered question: why 24? Why not 23? Or 25? Why always, obsessively? 24. Patterns emerged in the theories. 24 hours in a day. 24 letters in some older alphabets. 24 elders in the Book of Revelation. Perhaps, some suggested, the sisters were bound to the very structure of time itself. They were not merely children, they were markers, anchors, or even prisoners of time, destined to hold its flow in balance. To see them unchanged through the decades was not a miracle, but a warning that time itself could fracture, and that the sisters were both symptom and safeguard. But if they were safeguards, what happened when the orphanage dissolved? Did the sisters scatter to maintain balance elsewhere, or did their release signify something darker, that time's anchor had been cut, leaving them free to walk where they pleased? Unbound by years, folklorists compiling the stories in the 1970s noted a chilling trend. In interviews, witnesses described the girls not only as unchanged but as increasingly present, where once they were confined to glimpses at windows or apparitions in fields. By the mid-20th century they appeared in homes, on roads, even in crowded towns, always silent, always pale, always vanishing the moment one tried to touch them. If the theories of containment were true, then their appearances suggested not protection but expansion. Others took comfort in believing the sisters were simply legend, that stories of identical children across decades were just echoes, folklore passed down and reimagined. But the consistency of detail, the number, the whiteness of their gowns, the unchanging faces undermines the dismissal. Can legend remain so precise for over a century without root in something real? One unsettling detail binds the forbidden theories every scholar, every doctor, every priest who studied the sisters too closely seemed to vanish from the record. Their names erased, their writings hidden, their reputations dissolved, as though the sisters themselves reached into history to erase those who sought truth. Or perhaps others' churches, governments, secret orders buried the accounts to avoid unleashing panic. And so, the sisters remain in the liminal space between fact and folklore, feared not for what they are, but for what they might mean. Are they the evidence of humanity's darkest experiment? The outcome of Eveline's forbidden pact? Or something cosmic? Anchoring time itself, we cannot know. But imagine standing before them, counting the faces until you reach 24. Would you believe they were children cursed to stillness? Or time's eternal prisoners? Or dolls made animate by a bargain too dark to speak whatever you chose? Would your belief matter, or would the sisters simply watch, unchanged, as if your thoughts were nothing more than another storm passing through? Theories do not comfort, they only deepen the dread, and dread, once it grips, does not let go. The legend of the 24 sisters did not die with the orphanage's collapse. If anything, its disappearance made the story stronger. By the mid-20th century, families moving into the valleys inherited not only farmland and homes, but also an unease passed down like a curse. They whispered that Eveline's children still walked among them, not bound to stone walls but free, blending into a world unprepared for their silence. One of the earliest modern accounts came from a soldier returning from the First World War. Exhausted and half-dazed, he swore that while passing through a rural station late at night, he saw 24 children sitting perfectly still on a bench, their faces pale and eyes vacant, believing it a dream. He rubbed his eyes, yet they remained. When the train arrived and passengers shuffled on, the children did not move. He boarded quickly, unwilling to look again. Decades later, he confessed that those were the only faces from his youth that haunted him more than the battlefield. In the 1950s, a schoolteacher claimed that while leading her class in a history lesson, she noticed 24 children she did not recognize sitting in the back row. They wore outdated clothes, white and threadbare, and their eyes were fixed not on her but on the crucifix above the blackboard. She blinked, and they were gone. Her students denied ever seeing them. Yet her attendance book that day recorded 24 extra names, scrawled in identical handwriting. The page was torn out, though she kept the memory until her dying breath. By the 1970s, urban legends grew bolder. Hikers reported groups of pale girls standing in circles deep in the woods. Hands joined, faces lifted to the moon. Drivers on rural highways swore they saw 24 figures crossing the road at once, vanishing as headlights struck them. A police officer responding to a missing child case claimed he found 24 small footprints burned into the frost outside the home. Each print pressed deep as though by something heavier than a child's weight. Some speculated that the sisters had multiplied, or that new girls had been taken to join their number. Yet the count never wavered, always 24. Never more, never less. If a witness thought to see only 23, a final face would emerge, hidden in the shadows, restoring the balance. The number itself seemed to carry a gravity that bound them as tightly as Eveline's rosary once had. What unsettled people most was not their presence in isolated places, but their intrusion into ordinary life. A man walking home from work in 1986 reported being followed by 24 footsteps echoing his own, though the streets were empty. A mother claimed her baby's monitor picked up faint voices, 24 voices murmuring lullabies in a language she could not recognize. A photographer developing film in his darkroom found, again and again, blurred rows of children standing behind him, though no one had been present when he took the pictures. The question remains, are the sisters still children? Or has time passed for them in ways invisible to us? Do they think, feel, and grow internally while their bodies remain unchanged? Or are they something else entirely beyond childhood, beyond humanity? Wearing the faces of little girls because that form unsettles us most. Some modern theories suggest they walk among us unnoticed, their presence obscured until they choose to reveal themselves. Imagine passing a group of children in a playground, convinced they are ordinary, only to realize hours later you counted exactly 24, each one strangely still. Imagine a school photograph where, upon closer inspection, the same face repeats 24 times in different positions. Such tales circulate online, stripped of names and dates, yet carrying the same dread as the original whispers from the valley. If Eveline was truly their guardian, then who watches them now? Do they require guardianship at all? Or have they become their own keepers, bound only to the laws of permanence? Some insist Eveline still walks with them, unchanged as well, her pale eyes glowing faintly as she leads them through back roads and abandoned houses. Others believe she was consumed by them. Her soul spread evenly across 24 bodies, leaving no trace but their continued survival. What seems certain is that they have not vanished. In the last decade, travelers and locals alike have shared eerie reports: 24 girls walking a dirt road at dawn, 24 figures reflected in a store's glass though only one stood outside, 24 shadows stretching from a single child under the streetlight. Always 24. Always unchanged. And so the curse, or whatever it may be, remains unbroken. Perhaps it cannot be broken. Perhaps the sisters are not meant to pass into adulthood, into time, into death. They are a reminder, an eternal wound carved into the world that some mysteries are not meant to resolve, that some stories are not meant to end. If you drive through that valley today, watch the fields carefully. Count the figures you see if you dare. But remember this: once you begin counting, you may not be able to stop. And if you reach 24, do not look away too quickly. For when you turn your back, you may hear 24 voices whispering your name. The story of Eveline and her 24 sisters leaves us with dread, not closure. Were they cursed children, failed experiments, or eternal guardians of time itself, or were they never human at all, but something that chose human form to haunt us more deeply? What do you believe really happened if you enjoyed this descent into dark, forgotten history? Subscribe for more stories that history tried to erase, and continue watching this video here, where another tale waits to unsettle your sleep. Some legends fade when their buildings fall and their witnesses die, but not this one. The orphanage may be gone. Eveline's name may be erased from official records, but the sisters linger. They have become more than a story. They are an idea that refuses to die, a presence that drifts wherever people are willing to look too closely at the edges of night. The unease remains strongest in those who believe they have glimpsed the sisters for themselves. Drivers who swerve to avoid 24 children crossing a road. Parents who count too many shadows in their home. Hikers who swear they hear laughter echoing from empty valleys. These accounts persist not because they can be proven, but because they awaken something primal, the fear of time stopped, of life without growth, of faces that remain forever young while the rest of us wither. What if they are still here? What if they are waiting? And what if their number 24 holds meaning greater than we dare to guess? Were they Eveline's burden alone? Or is the burden now ours, carried forward by every telling of their story we cannot answer? But perhaps that is the point. Some mysteries are too heavy for truth, and some horrors survive precisely because they remain unresolved. The sisters endure not in facts, but in dread. A reminder that what terrifies us most is the possibility that they might be real. What do you believe really happened in that orphanage? Were the sisters victims, monsters, or something else entirely? Leave your thoughts below, because the story lives only as long as it is retold. Subscribe for more stories history tried to erase. And if you dare, continue watching this video here.